If your pastor told you that the sacrifices in the Old Testament were typologies pointing towards Jesus Christ's final sacrifice, then your pastor doesn't know anything about the ancient world, and I'm going to prove it. There are two really good examples from the ancient literature that demonstrate that not only were these sacrifices common, they weren't unique to the Bible, and everybody else was already doing them long before the Israelites. Now, before we look at those two examples, we should read a little snippet from Hebrews chapters 10. Hebrews 10 talks about how the Old Testament sacrificial system, specifically the atoning rituals, were a foreshadowing or a typology of things yet to come. And we read in verse 12, "But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. And since then, he has been waiting until his enemies would be made a footstool for his feet. For by a single offering, he has perfected for all time those who are sanctified." So we have this idea that the Old Testament sacrifices were pointing towards this final sacrifice, and God was putting those sacrifices in place so that when he executed Jesus, people would understand. They would see the foreshadowing, they would see the typology. But I think we're going to demonstrate here with two really good examples from the ancient world that what was happening with the sacrifices in the Old Testament weren't foreshadowing anything. They weren't typologies of Jesus. They were just commonplace, run of the mill rituals that everybody was already doing. Now, the Day of Atonement ritual in Leviticus 16 has a couple different parts. The part that we're concerned with is when it deals with two different goats that are for the sin of the people of Israel. The first goat's going to be slaughtered, and the blood of that goat is going to be placed or sprinkled in the temple or in the tabernacle to purify the tabernacle from the sins of the people that have been in it or even around it. The second goat is going to be kept alive, and all the sins of the people are going to be confessed over the head of the goat while laying on hands, and the sins of the people will be transferred to that goat, and then that goat is sent out into the wilderness. Now, it's generally observed in the ancient world that the wilderness, the desert places, is where the unclean spirits dwelt. So the general idea is that the uncleanliness, the sinfulness of the people are going to be sent back to its origin, where the unclean demons and spirits are. That being said, I'm going to read this from the NRSV, and the NRSV treats the word Azazel as being some sort of a demonic entity in which the sins are going back to. Your translation might not. Some translations understand the goat itself as being called the Azazel. It's not entirely sure in the ancient Hebrew what's actually happening here, and the scholarly literature is a little bit divided. I only preface that to say when I read mine, yours might sound only slightly different, but let's go over it and touch on these bullet points. "He shall take two goats and set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And Aaron shall cast lots on the two goats, one lot for the Lord and the other lot for Azazel. Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord and offer it as a purification offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azazel. He shall slaughter the goat of the purification offering that is for the people and bring its blood inside the curtain and do with its blood as he did with the blood of the bull, sprinkling it upon the cover and before the cover." So those are the general points of the two goat ritual. And when we read these next two pieces of literature from the ancient world, I think you're going to find that there's actually a lot of crossover with already established traditions. Our first piece of literature is very archaic. It's ancient Sumerian, and it preserves an incantation that demonstrates that animals can be substituted for mankind. And this is just one of many. In fact, there's a number of ancient rituals in Akkadian and Sumerian where animals are being placed next to an individual, and sicknesses and things of that nature are being cast from the individual into the animal, and then the animal gets disposed of. So there's this idea that you can transfer impurity and sin into an animal. And this particular short snippet is typically referred to as the Sumerian doctrine of substitution. And it says, "To the wise man he spoke, a lamb is a substitute for a man. A lamb he gives for his life. The head of the lamb he gives for the head of the man. The neck of the lamb he gives for the neck of the man. The breast of the lamb he gives for the breast of a man." So we already have this idea. many, many hundreds of years before the Bible was ever written, that there's a lamb or there's animals that can be substituted for either the life or the sin of a human being. And of course, this makes a lot of sense because in the ancient world, we have a lot of rituals where sin and impurities and sicknesses are being transferred from a human being to an animal because this is the way they conceived the world to work. This wasn't a typology, it wasn't a foreshadowing. Here's a really interesting text to demonstrate this principle. It's from the Neo Assyrian period, roughly around the beginning of the Iron Age. And it says, the Erishu shall give the order and cut off the head of the sheep. With the body of the sheep, the Mashmashu shall purify the temple. He shall recite the incantations to exercise the temple. He shall purify all the naos and its circumference, and then he shall take away the platter. The Mashmashu shall carry away the body of the sheep, and shall place it in the river Nala at evening and cast it into the river, the body of the sheep. He shall depart into the country. The Erishu, the head of the sheep, the Mashmashu, and the Erishu shall depart into the country. All that which belongs to Nabu, that's a deity in the ancient world, Lord of Babylon, they shall not introduce into Babylon. From the 5th to the 12th day, they shall remain in the country. So it's a little bit cryptic if you're not used to reading some of these ancient incantations, but essentially what's happening is the animals being slaughtered. Some of the blood, just like in the Israelite ritual, is going to be purifying the temple. And then another part, the body and the head of the sheep, now that they're impure, now that the sinfulness and the impurity of the temple and otherwise are going to be inside of the body and the head of the sheep that's been bisected, they're going to be taken out into the wilderness. One part gets put into the river. Remember, there are river demons or deities in the ancient world, and the other goes into the desert, into the wilderness, just like the scapegoat from Leviticus 16, another place where, demons and deities and spirits dwell. So the general idea here is that we can use an animal, we can take the impure stuff from around us and we could put it into the animal and then we can dispose of the animal somewhere. The difference between this and Leviticus 16 is in this particular ritual, it's just one animal. There's not a dead animal and then a live animal. There's a dead animal that does everything. The blood purifies the temple, and then the dead animal also takes on the impurities and it gets disposed of where it belongs. And so this idea in the Bible that like, well, God did all these elaborate rituals because he just needed to, point you back to Jesus so that you would understand that Jesus' sacrifice meant something. It's just kind of nonsense. In fact, if you read the ancient literature, there are dozens and dozens and dozens examples of all of the rituals you find in the Old Testament. The splitting of animals and walking between them to make a covenant, that's there. The daily sacrifices, that's there. The intermittent sacrifices when you've become aware that you've made a sin, that's all there. All of these rituals and offerings were already in the ancient world long before the Israelites ever adopted them into their culture, even the clean and unclean animals. In fact, in ancient Egypt, they even had a mythology that described why it was that the pigs were unclean for you to eat. So, this isn't unique. This is not a typology. If your pastor is telling you that these sacrifices were put in place by God to point you towards Jesus, he doesn't know anything or she doesn't know anything about the ancient world. You should read some of the ancient literature. And there's a really good free resource, in fact, that you can download today, won't cost you a dime, that will help you out in understanding the ancient world. If you go to archive.org or just type in the name of this book, it's now in the open domain. It was done by a really well respected scholar, Samuel Driver. It's called Cuneiform Parallels to the Old Testament. It's exactly what you would think. It's full of ancient parallels to the Old Testament stories and to the Old Testament rituals. And it won't cost you a penny to get. Go to archive.org and get yourself a copy. You'll have a much better understanding of the ancient world if you go through, even just skim through this book. And while you're at it, there are two other resources you should know about. There's a really interesting two-volume series on archive.org, and you can get it elsewhere, called The Devils and Evil Spirits of Babylonia. Again, they're ancient texts from Babylon slash Mesopotamia that give you an idea of what people did in the ancient world. They had incantations. There are descriptions of these clean and unclean spirits. There are rituals to get rid of various ailments like fevers and toothaches. So, if you want to know what they were doing in the ancient world, how they conceived of this spirit realm and these offerings and sacrifices, this is another good resource. And last but not least, I would also point you towards a web series that I started some time ago, and it's on YouTube. It's called Readings from the Ancient Near East. There are a bunch of these readings from ancient literature that you can just listen to. You don't even have to get the books that I've been putting out. I don't know how many videos are up here now, 30 videos. I'll keep adding to it, but there's all kinds of rituals and incantations and prayers from the ancient world that you can listen to on this particular YouTube channel. It's called Readings from the Ancient Near East, and I think the handle is just called The Ancient Near East. So I would definitely recommend you guys checking it out. I think if you want to know about the ancient context of the Bible, this is a good place to start.